The war in Ukraine has been dragging on for weeks now. Nobody knows exactly how it's going to end, probably not even Putin himself, but it's important nonetheless to speculate what the outcome may be and formulate investment strategies. Our next guest is here to do exactly that. Marko Papic is an expert on military strategy and geopolitical strategies, and he is the chief strategist at Clocktower Group, an alternative asset management firm. Prior to Clocktower, he was the chief strategist at BCA Research's Geopolitical Strategy Service. And before that, he was a senior analyst at Stratfor. Marko is also the author of Geopolitical Alpha, an investment framework for predicting the future. And we'll be talking about this book and how to apply its teachings to the current environment. Welcome to the show, Marko.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure, David.
Yeah, been looking forward to speaking with you for a very long time. You are an expert on all things geopolitics and military analysis, so I'm very much looking forward to getting your take on what is going on with Ukraine. I want to start by talking about recent military developments. The Russian forces have been encircling the city of Kiev for quite some time, but it's failed to take it completely. Now, I'm just scoping out here, macro picture. The Ukrainian and Russian military forces have a huge disparity in manpower, budget, defense spending. The Russians, for example, have been spending more than $61 billion of defense spending, one of the largest defense spendings in the world. The Ukrainians have only a fraction of that. And if you look at their manpower, attacking aircraft, for example, I'm looking at one source from the CBC, attacking aircraft, the Russians have over 1,300, the Ukrainians have less than 200. Same with tanks, just a huge disparity of more than 10 times the size of the Ukrainian forces. Why is Russia having such a hard time, it seems, overtaking some of their objectives?
Well, the issue is if you play Risk, when you attack, the defender gets to win if there's a tie in the dice roll. And there's a reason for that, because when you're on defense, you have the advantage. You can draw out your attackers' supply lines, which is what the Ukrainians did by withdrawing into cities. They did not meet the Russians on the border, as I guess the Russians expected. And also because you get to fight in your own territory. The other issue is that Ukrainians have actually done really well over the last 8 years in the Donbas region. If you look at the performance of the Ukrainian military fighting the pro-Russian rebels, who were materially supported by Russians, also there were a lot of Russian volunteers and irregulars fighting on behalf of these rebels. You can see that only 40% of these two oblasts, just a word for a state, 40% of them, 40% of that territory was conquered by the pro-Russian rebels. And that really should have flagged some risks to the Russians that Ukrainians actually know how to fight in their own turf. The other issue is that, you've cited a lot of quantitative advantages, David. The issue is that Russians have elected to spread out their forces across really 12, 14 lines of attack. That's another thing they could have learned from Risk. You don't do that. You just put all your troops together and you make a run for the board. The Russians, for some reason, decided not to do that. So their 160 to 190,000 troops have been salami sliced into 12, 14 different attack vectors. Each one of those really has only 10 to 20,000 troops. And when you consider Ukraine's size, I mean, this is a country, it's a territory the size of Germany and the United Kingdom combined. When you have 10 or 20,000 troops going deep into enemy territory, they get really exposed and they're at risk of losing the connection to the rest of the supporters and supplies. And that's what's happened to the Russians throughout this conflict.
Are you surprised at the sparing use of the Russian Air Force? Where were the bombers? Where were the jet fighters in the early days of the war? It seems to be lacking in this theater of war, and that surprised a lot of analysts, at least in the beginning. What's your take?
Yeah, so one of the things my first initial reaction to the conflict, literally when the Russian troops rolled across the border, was the lack of what's called SAD operations, suppression of enemy air defense. This is something that America has done in every war it's conducted for the past 20, 30 years. You spend sometimes up to multiple weeks softening the radar installations. The way you do that is that you go in with fighter jets that are then lit up by the radar system of the country you're attacking. You then use anti-radiation missiles to take out those radar installations. Once the radars are gone, the surface-to-air missile batteries are basically inoperable. And those operations are very dangerous for fighter jet pilots. They take a long time. They delay the eventual incursion into the country. Russia seemed to have basically wanted to do a blitzkrieg without conducting these operations. And so it went in with low altitude flying aircraft, including helicopters, which is suicide. It's suicide because Ukraine is not Iraq. It's not Afghanistan. It is a country that for the past 70 years has basically waited for an air invasion. That's why Ukraine has sophisticated Cold War era air defense systems. And so they're more than capable of destroying low-flying aircraft, given that Russia has not dealt with their radar installations. Plus, of course, Ukraine is now so full of Stingers and kind of the man pads, which are, man-portable air defense, rockets and missiles, that it's very dangerous for Russian low-flying aircraft to come in. It seems that Russia has therefore elected to not endanger the fighter jets and the bombers that you cite. Like it clearly has them, it has a quantitative advantage, but they are vulnerable without having done the SEAD operations. I also think that Russia has revealed that it doesn't really have good command and control. So whereas the United States of America has the AWACS that control the operations on the ground, Russia is much more concerned about what's going to happen to its fighter jets if they are basically above Ukrainian airspace. The fact that we're now 4 weeks into this and they still don't control the air is a real indictment into their ability to conduct modern warfare.
Marko, you've studied military powers around the world for years, so you're an expert on foreign and domestic military powers. Would you make the assessment or the statement that Russia has not used its best weapons and systems yet in the war?
No, I wouldn't make that statement. I think they have used their best systems, and this is it. I would say that they haven't elected to use the best strategy, so that's an issue. But I think what we have to understand is that in 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, it was, obviously won, because Georgia was basically incapable of defending itself against such a powerful rival. But there was a real chaos in command and control. There were incidents where like fighter jet pilots were using, text messages to find out where they were supposed to drop their bombs. It was a real mess. And so Russia went out and supposedly modernized its military. But I think one of the reasons that they're facing these challenges is that when Russia modernized its military, it did so in kind of a piecemeal fashion, where it basically decided to just get 2 or 4 of each. They went and they said, okay, what does America have? Well, we'll have 2 of each. The problem is that means that they are kind of mile wide, but surface deep in capacity. So yes, can they launch an amphibious assault in Mariupol? They can. They have some amphibious assets. Is it a smart idea to do so? No. And they didn't really focus on kind of core competencies and really bolster those. They just kind of built a military that looks great in a parade. They got 2 of each, but it doesn't mean that they can really conduct such a complicated attack like what's going on in Ukraine.
Let's look at the Ukrainians' weapons that they've been using. Ukrainians have not completely been without aid. As you know, Biden recently announced $800 billion of aid, direct military aid to the Ukrainians. And the Germans have promised 1,000 anti-tank missiles, 500 Stinger missiles. Even the Swiss have promised some sort of aid, either financially or directly. And so you're talking about a lot of NATO weapons in the possession of the Ukrainian armed forces. Do you think that has made any significant impact whatsoever?
Yes, absolutely. Although I would argue that Ukrainian tactics early on in the war probably did more than the aid. The aid is very conducive to helping the type of tactics that the Ukrainians are using. What I mean by that is that by electing not to face Russia's mechanized armor in open field, which was really smart, by withdrawing into the cities, Ukraine has turned this into a dogfight. In addition to that, that's where those Stingers and the Javelins become so useful in that kind of urbanized combat that the Russians are not very good at. Quite frankly, nobody's really good at it. It's very, very challenging. It costs a lot of lives. You have to dismount your troops so that they can fan out across the streets, so that they can protect the armor from missile attacks. And that's a very costly strategy. It's something the US has had to do in Iraq and Afghanistan. Russians, if they intend to assault these cities, are going to have to do the same. And that's why they're, as you said at the beginning, they're encircling them. They're encircling them because they're afraid to actually go in. They're probably encircling them so that they can just compel a change in the sort of political direction in Ukraine. So they're trying to compel Zelensky and the government to negotiate by causing civilian casualties because they don't have any other options.
Can you then make a deduction on Putin's political objectives just based on his military strategy so far? I mean, just out of context here, for context rather, the Russians have, bombers. I've alluded to high altitude bombers. They have the capability of leveling Ukrainian cities. I'm not saying that should be the strategy that they should take. Not at all. I'm just saying that is potentially an option. Of course, they also have nukes. The fact that they're withholding from doing either of those things may suggest that Putin has higher objectives than just destroying Ukraine, correct?
I don't know. I mean, at this point, it's not clear. I think clearly the operations in the south suggest that perhaps they're trying to connect Donbas with Crimea, with this land bridge to Crimea. So I think that's fair. Taking all of the Black Sea coast may be one of the options. But I'm not really sure what the long-term objective here is. And here's why. It's really difficult to occupy Ukraine. There is no compelling group of people in Ukraine who are pro-Russian. If there were, they were in Donbas and Crimea. And, Putin took those away in 2014. So this idea that there can be a puppet government or like Russia can take Eastern Ukraine. First of all, Eastern Ukraine is like the size of Germany, and it's hostile to Russia. So if the United States of America, a country whose economy is 20 times larger than Russia, whose military is clearly much better than Russia, couldn't really pacify Iraq and Afghanistan, by the way, two countries that welcome large proportions of both countries' populations initially welcomed American invasion. In Iraq, obviously, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni dictator running a Shia country. So even with that, it became a mess. Now, how is Russia going to do that? It would have to basically use a massive invasion force that would have to stay there for decades to help some sort of a puppet regime. So to answer your question quickly, I have no idea what Putin's goal is here. There are some outlines in terms of the South and maybe the access to the Black Sea, cutting that off for Ukraine. But I think even that will be extremely costly to retain. So maybe he is actually just switching to a much simpler strategy, which is punish Ukraine for wanting to be in the West, punish Ukraine for having an alternative domestic political system that threatens his own through an example. And so this is a punitive operation that basically sends a message to the rest of the post-Soviet Union space of what happens if you try to join the West and abandon the Russian sphere of influence.
Well, regardless of his ultimate objectives, do you think Putin has the resources, either in terms of finance or manpower, to continue this much longer? Let's just take a look at the losses from the Russian side so far. Now, it varies depending on which source you're talking to. The Russians estimate about 500 KIA. The Ukrainians estimate about 12,000 killed in action. The Americans estimates are somewhere in between about 2,000 to 4,000 KIA. Regardless of what the number is, let's just take the middle ground. Let's just take the American estimates. 4,000 estimated KIAs within a matter of weeks is a lot. Do you think they have the ability to continue this much longer, assuming the same rate of loss?
Oh, absolutely not. And by the way, the Russian number you quoted is from the first 5 days. So the Russian Ministry of Defense came out the first 5 days and said we have 500 losses. The United States of America had 500 losses in the first year of operations in Iraq. Russian troop losses are probably right now rivaling the troop losses in the 94-96 Chechen War, which they lost, by the way. That was the first Chechen War. Chechnya was de facto independent afterwards because Russia lost. And that caused a lot of political pressure on Yeltsin. It was one of the reasons he was ultimately replaced. So my point about all this is no, I don't think Russia has the material or political fortitude to really withstand this war for a long period of time. So my bet, and it's a low conviction bet because, hey, Putin has ignored his material constraints throughout most of this crisis. My bet would be that he does proclaim victory, that he takes Ukraine's offer of neutrality as a mission accomplished moment, that he claims he demilitarized the country, which he can. I mean, he has destroyed a lot of its industry or infrastructure and airfields and so on. And that he basically says that, Donbass and Crimea are now either Russian or independent or whatever he wants. And that's a fait accompli. I think with those three things, Russia can raise the mission accomplished banner, proclaim victory, and get out as fast as it can before this becomes extremely onerous for it domestically. The problem is, I'm not sure that the US removes sanctions. And so that means then for investors, this is no longer really a military conflict. It becomes an economic war between the largest commodity exporter in the world and the West.
Okay. We're going to circle back on investment implications toward the end of the interview. Let's move on outside of Ukraine now. Let's talk about China. How do you think China is viewing this conflict in Eastern Europe, and what do you think they're planning next in response?
Well, I think that China wasn't aware of the scale of this attack. I mean, it's just absolutely enormous. The most important economic relationship in the world right now is that of China and Europe. In terms of dollar amount, that economic relationship has replaced China and the US, and before that, Europe and the US is the largest trading relationship on the planet. The worst thing that can happen for China is that the West is coalesced into a singular core as it was during the Cold War. In other words, China will not survive as a geopolitical power in a bipolar world because US, Europe, and their Asian allies together are much more powerful than China and Russia. I mean, Russia at this point is, a gas station with nukes. And so because of this, I actually think that one, Beijing probably did not know that this was going to happen. And two, I don't think that there's anything that's happening in Ukraine right now that would encourage anyone, let alone China, to be geopolitically aggressive and allow for the West to be coalesced. So I think you will see a much more conciliatory Beijing over the next couple of weeks as it tries to position itself as a peacemaker, because it needs to prove to Europe, its most important trade relationship, that Europe should not join the US in a coalition against China.
Your analysis runs counter to some other analysts I've spoken to who have told me that maybe now is the right time to take over Taiwan either through force or through political coercion because the world is distracted. How would you respond to that?
Oh, man. Yeah, that would be a very bad moment. It would be a very bad moment to take Taiwan. First of all, the rest of the world, like Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, they've been watching the US basically bomb countries left, right, and center. And David, it's like me and you watching a layup line at an NBA game, and we're like, oh, that looks pretty simple. Why don't we join? So you and I decide to join the game, and I tear my ACL and you dislocate both your shoulders. Okay, that's the outcome. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that for a very long time, everyone's been watching the US conduct these military operations with ease. Now they're seeing what happens when one of them does it. Now they're playing the game themselves. They're no longer watching the layup line, and it looks a lot harder. So that's the first thing I would say. Conducting a complicated military expedition like this, especially one across the Taiwanese Straits, is complicated. Second, the unified Western response, especially the central bank sanctions, are a real deterrent. It's something that people didn't expect. But I would actually go further. The one thing I didn't expect in this conflict is the way the private sector basically turned cancel culture against Russia. That's in a very uncoordinated way. By the way, that's something that, I don't think the Russian leaders understand. There is nobody behind this. The White House didn't call Starbucks and tell them to pull out of Russia. These corporations did that on their own. And I think that's something that a country like China is definitely watching. And just like I am and just like you are, we're all surprised by how quickly it all happened. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is the worst time for them to attack anyone and for any country, honestly, to be geopolitically assertive, especially because right now the West is united. Now, I think in 6 months, in 12 months, Europe is going to take a cold shower, if you will, and kind of contemplate why is there a war in Ukraine? And they're probably going to come up with a number of reasons, including that the US kind of instigated it by writing checks it cannot cash with Ukrainian NATO membership. And so I do think the fissures in the West will grow over the next 12 to 18 months. That's where I also disagree with kind of the consensus view that says, oh, transatlanticism is back. I'm not sure it is. But if China or any other country kind of incites further aggression, then the West could be coalesced, and then we will be in that bipolar world. And anyone who challenges the combined power of the West, Japan, Southeast Asian allies, it's not a moment to do that. I think that would be folly.
I have one more question about China, and we'll talk about your investment implications in your book finally. Now, the China-Taiwan issue, this has been debated a lot. The notion that China's military versus Taiwan's military, huge disparity again on paper, but you just said that a cross-strait operation is not easy, even for a military the size of China. So let's say if China were forced to invade Taiwan today, let's just say, hypothetically, the U.S. doesn't get involved. Could they do it?
Could it do it? Yeah, I mean, like, I think they could. I think that is possible. But, like, there's all these things that we cannot predict very well. And the civilian casualties issues could be an issue that causes a lot of problems, and the economic consequences. So, yeah, militarily, I think they could. But there's all sorts of other problems. The other issue is we don't know how the U.S. would react, not in terms of defending Taiwan necessarily, but for example, by interdicting oil shipments to China as part of its retaliation. And China still does depend on seaborne trade for much of its oil imports. So that's something that I think would be a potential consequence in the deterrent.
Now, you've written a book that teaches readers how to invest during geopolitical turmoil. It's called Geopolitical Alpha, an investment framework for predicting the future. Now, obviously, nobody has a crystal ball, but you've outlined geopolitical risks and things to watch quite clearly in your book. Give us a synopsis of what you've written and how to apply some of your theories to today's situation.
I think, well, it's very simple. We obsess about what's inside people's heads, policymaker heads, their preferences. The problem with preferences is that they're optional. They don't have to be acted on. And also, they're subject to material constraints. Whereas the material reality, the constraints that surround policymakers are neither optional, they're real, nor are they subject to preferences. Think about your own life, David. There's many things you want to do, but you're bound by your material constraints. So if I want to predict what kind of a car David's going to buy, or what kind of a, vacation David's going to go to, it's not about your personality. It's about what you can kind of afford, what can you do, how much time do you have on your hands. And that's what I'm trying to teach investors. This framework, and I don't call it a theory, I don't call it a method, it's a framework, is not always going to be right, but it gives you something to begin your analysis with. And I think that investors have to begin doing their own geopolitical analysis. That's why I wrote the book. We cannot keep outsourcing it to like former policymakers who are past their expiration date, who haven't actually had access to intelligence for years, and we're just asking them for their opinion. That's not going to work. We need to start off with a fundamental bottom-up approach to geopolitical analysis, and then we can start thinking about preferences and so on. So in the case of Russia, Ukraine today, if you had studied the material constraints of Ukrainian demographics, Ukrainian geography, Russian military capability, Russian military experience, you would not be really surprised by a lot of what's going on today. What's going on today are these material constraints manifesting themselves in reality.
Okay. Well, we can find this book on Amazon. Fantastic read. So, final question, tying it back to today's environment, some investment implications and picks that you would recommend to your viewers.
I think it's the market rally right now, and I'm just looking at my Bloomberg screen, is very surprising to me. I mean, you have financial conditions that are tightening, you have global liquidity that's going down, and you have a very hawkish Fed. I think eventually the Fed does pivot. I think they don't want the recession. They don't care about inflation more than recession. But I think that the strike price of that put is lower. And so I would fade the rally in equities. I would focus as an investor on those things where I do have a high conviction view, and that would be commodities, not necessarily oil. I'm worried about American diplomacy compelling Saudi Arabia to produce more oil. So I like commodities like softs and also metals. And I also think there is a compelling case for precious metals, given that I think real yields are going to be further negative. Finally, if you do want to be in equities, I would rotate out of tech, and I would be in inflation-proof sectors such as real estate, materials, energy, and healthcare.
Excellent. Marko, I want to thank you so much for your insights and your deep dive into the Ukraine-Russia crisis. I hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Pleasure.
Thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm David Lin. Stay tuned.